Hello and welcome back to HIV RNA Test Guide Podcast, your trusted source for HIV information and resources. Feels like every month we get news of some incredible advancement in HIV, but that question always lingers. Are we on the brink of a cure?
It's the question on everyone's mind, right?
Yeah.
It really is a thrilling time to be following HIV research, I think. There's so much to cover today, from really promising vaccine trials to some pretty big breakthroughs in just understanding how our immune system responds to the HIV virus.
Absolutely. So let's jump right in. One of the things that really caught my eye this month was this study out of Scripps Research. They were talking about these anti-immune complex antibodies and how some HIV vaccines seem to be triggering them. But it seems like they're targeting these immune complexes instead of directly attacking the virus.
Yeah, this is groundbreaking stuff. For years, research has been so focused on vaccines that create antibodies that can directly neutralize HIV. But this discovery suggests that there might be another mechanism at play. Imagine these immune complexes as clumps of antibodies that are already attached to the virus. These anti-immune complex antibodies then go after those clumps.
So it's not a direct attack, it's more of a chain reaction.
Exactly, a second wave of defense, if you will. And the million-dollar question is, does this actually help us fight HIV, or does it hinder our efforts? It's definitely possible that these larger complexes actually trigger a stronger immune response overall, but on the other hand, it might mean that those first antibodies aren't as effective on their own.
So it's not just about creating antibodies, it's about understanding that whole cascade of immune responses and then figuring out how to create the most effective ones.
You got it. This research could totally revolutionize how we design HIV vaccines in the future. Imagine being able to tailor vaccines to enhance or minimize this response depending on which proves to be more effective. It opens a whole new avenue of exploration.
That's incredible. It really just highlights how complex this virus is. But speaking of exciting developments, there are a few HIV vaccine candidates that are making headlines right now. We're hearing about mRNA vaccines, viral vector vaccines, and protein-based vaccines all in clinical trials. Can you tell us a bit more about how each of these works?
Each approach has its own unique way of working with its own benefits and drawbacks. mRNA vaccines, which we all became familiar with during the COVID pandemic, essentially give your cells instructions. They tell them to produce viral proteins, and those proteins then trigger an immune response.
It's like giving our cells a blueprint for how to fight the virus.
Perfect analogy. So then we've got viral vector vaccines. These use a harmless virus to deliver HIV genes into the body, and those genes in turn trigger an immune response.
And protein-based vaccines are more about just introducing specific HIV proteins to the immune system, right?
Right, but even the technology behind these vaccines has advanced so much in recent years. Advancements in something called adjuvant technology and protein design are making them so much more effective than they used to be.
It really does sound like we're seeing progress on multiple fronts, which is incredibly encouraging. But even with the most effective vaccine out there, I keep thinking about this issue of global access. It's just a fact that not everyone is going to have equal access to these groundbreaking treatments.
You've hit on a major point. Global collaboration and access to medicine are completely essential in this fight. And that brings us to another exciting development, Lenacapavir. It was actually recently recognized as Science Magazine's Breakthrough of the Year.
Yeah, the twice-yearly injection for HIV prevention. I've been wanting to hear more about this one.
Lenacapavir is a long-acting drug that can both prevent new HIV infections and also manage the virus in people who are already living with HIV. The fact that it's long-acting is a game changer. It means that people don't need to take a pill every day, which can be a big burden for a lot of people.
That must make such a difference in people's lives. But I can't help but wonder about the cost. Will this be a treatment that's available to everyone?
That's the question, isn't it? Affordability and expanding production are going to be key if we want to ensure that everyone has access to these life-saving drugs, and not just those who can afford them.
It just feels like a moral imperative.
Yeah.
We can't allow these scientific breakthroughs to only be available to the privileged while others are left behind.
I completely agree. It's not just about developing these medicines, it's about making sure that everyone who could benefit from them can actually access them. And on that note, we can't forget about the importance of prevention. Even without a vaccine, we already have effective ways to stop HIV transmission, and those methods are constantly getting better.
You're right. Let's talk about pre-EP and PP. I know they're absolutely essential in this fight, but I think there's still a lot of people out there who have questions about how they work and how to access them.
Well, Pre-P, which stands for pre-exposure prophylaxis, is a daily pill that dramatically reduces the risk of getting HIV in people who are at high risk. Yeah. And we're actually now seeing newer forms of Pre-P, like long-acting injectables, that are becoming much more widely available.
Wow, that's amazing. I imagine that really helps people who might struggle to remember to take a pill every day.
It definitely does. And then we have PEP, or post-exposure prophylaxis. This is a short-term treatment that you take after a potential exposure to HIV.
So it's like an emergency break for HIV.
You could say that. And just like with PEP, new formulations and faster access to PEP are making it easier than ever for people to get this emergency prevention if they need it.
That's good to hear. And of course, we have to talk about antiretroviral therapy, or RT, which has just been completely revolutionary when it comes to treating HIV.
RT has become incredibly effective and more accessible with all these new drug classes and regimens that are available now. People with HIV can live long and healthy lives, and importantly, it reduces the risk of transmission significantly.
It's amazing how far we've come in terms of treatment. I remember when a diagnosis felt like a death sentence.
Yeah.
Now people with HIV can live full and active lives thanks to these incredible advances. But despite all this progress, it feels like there are still some pretty big challenges that we need to address, right?
Definitely. Issues of access and equity are still a huge hurdle. We need to make sure that everyone, regardless of their location or their socioeconomic status, can access these life-saving treatments and prevention methods.
And then there's the issue of stigma, which unfortunately is still a big problem. We can have all the scientific breakthroughs in the world, but if people are too afraid to get tested or seek treatment because of stigma, we're not going to make much progress.
Absolutely. Combating stigma has to be a top priority. And then there's the ever-present challenge of funding. We need continued investment in HIV research and prevention programs if we want to see this progress continue and eventually find a cure.
Which brings us to the big question. Are we any closer to actually eradicating HIV from the body? What's the latest when it comes to cure research?
It's a long road, but there's some truly exciting areas of research that are showing some promise. Things like gene editing and immunotherapy.
Those sound like some pretty high-tech solutions. Can you break those down for us?
Well, gene editing is all about modifying the genetic material of cells. In the context of HIV research, it is looking at ways to either remove the virus from infected cells or make the cells resistant to infection in the first place.
So it's like being able to go in and just edit the very code of our cells.
Exactly. Then there's immunotherapy, which is about boosting the body's own immune response to fight the virus. Imagine being able to train your immune system to be better at recognizing and attacking HIV.
Wow. It's incredible to think that these kinds of breakthroughs might be on the horizon. But I have a feeling this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? There's a lot more to discuss, especially when it comes to the political landscape, which hasn't exactly been smooth sailing lately.
You're right. There's been some concerning news on the political front. I'm afraid it could have a significant impact on the fight against HIV.
Okay, let's talk about it. What's going on?
Unfortunately, there's been a freeze on U.S. foreign aid for HIV programs, and it really stems from the current administration's America First agenda. So this has created a lot of uncertainty, especially in countries where these HIV programs depend heavily on U.S. support.
That's really concerning. What kind of impact are we talking about? What could be the consequences of this funding freeze?
Well, UNAIDS has painted a pretty grim picture. They're projecting that by 2029, we could see a 6-fold increase in new HIV infections. We're talking about millions of AIDS-related deaths and millions more children being orphaned as a result of these funding cuts.
Those numbers are just staggering. It's really hard to grasp the human cost behind statistics like that. Are there any real-world examples of how this is playing out already?
Oh, absolutely. We're already seeing the effects on the ground. In Kenya and Ethiopia, for example, thousands of healthcare workers have been laid off due to these funding cuts, and it's crippled their testing and prevention efforts.
That's heartbreaking to think about the ripple effects of these decisions. This isn't just a crisis for those countries, this has global implications, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. When you disrupt HIV prevention and treatment programs like this, it creates a breeding ground for drug-resistant strains of the virus. And then those strains can spread to other countries, potentially undoing years of progress in the global fight against HIV.
So it's a setback for everyone, not just the countries directly affected by the funding cuts. It's just devastating, especially when we consider the breakthroughs we were just talking about, like Lenacapavir.
Right. It's ironic. We have this incredibly effective tool for HIV prevention, but without the funding, many countries just won't be able to make it available to the people who need it the most. It really highlights how important it is to advocate for continued investment in global health initiatives.
It'd feel like a constant push and pull between these amazing scientific advancements and the political realities that can sometimes stand in the way. It can be discouraging, but I think it's so important for us to also highlight the positive developments as well. What are some of the things that are giving you hope right now in the fight against HIV?
Well, despite these setbacks, there's still so much to be hopeful about. I think one of the most encouraging trends we're seeing is the increasing availability of pre-OP in countries all around the world. More and more governments are adopting policies that make pre-OP accessible to those who need it most.
That's a huge step forward in terms of prevention. And what about treatment? Have there been any advancements in access to antiretroviral therapy?
Absolutely. The cost of RT has come down significantly in recent years, and now there are generic versions of many of these medications, which makes them much more affordable, especially in low and middle income countries.
That's fantastic news. It's a big win for global health equity. It's not just about affordability, though, is it? It's also about the quality of the medications and making sure that people living with HIV have access to the best possible treatment options.
You're right. We're also seeing the development of newer and more effective artery regimens. These newer medications are easier to take, they have fewer side effects, and they're even more effective at suppressing the virus.
So it's not just about surviving, it's about thriving. It's about ensuring that people living with HIV can live long, healthy, and fulfilling lives.
That's it. And it's not just about medication either. There's a growing emphasis on providing holistic care. Care that addresses the social, emotional, and psychological needs of people living with HIV.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that HIV is more than just a virus. It affects every aspect of a person's life.
Exactly. It's about creating a healthcare system that really supports people with HIV in every part of their well-being. And we're seeing some really innovative approaches to this kind of care being developed all over the world.
That brings us to another really exciting area of research, the quest for a universal HIV vaccine. We touched on this a little earlier, but I'd love to hear more about what's happening on that front.
Well, while Lenacapavir offers a powerful short-term solution for prevention, researchers are still working hard on a more permanent solution, a vaccine that could protect everyone from HIV. One scientist who's making waves in this area is Dr. Amelia Escolano.
I've read about her work. She's pioneering something called sequential immunization.
Right, you got it. It's a completely groundbreaking approach that's all about training antibodies to attack multiple variants of HIV. Dr. Escolano's research focuses on targeting what are called shared epitopes. These are parts of the virus that are common across different strains.
So it's like finding the weak spots that are the same across all the different versions of HIV.
Exactly. The goal is to develop a vaccine that can trigger the production of what we call broadly neutralizing antibodies. These are the antibodies that can neutralize a huge range of HIV variants.
This all sounds so promising, but I know that developing a vaccine is a really long and complicated process. Where's Dr. Escolano's research at right now?
Well, her team has had some very encouraging results in their preclinical trials. They've been able to show that they can create these broadly neutralizing antibodies in animal models, which is a huge step forward.
That's incredible. You know what really stood out to me about her research is that this vaccine can't cause infection. How is that possible?
Well, that's because Dr. Escolano's vaccine uses just fragments of the virus instead of the whole live virus. So it completely eliminates the risk of infection while still being able to trigger a really strong immune response.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
It could potentially make this one of the safest and most accessible HIV vaccines yet.
Exactly. If it's successful in human trials, it could be revolutionary, especially for global health equity. It has the potential to be the most affordable HIV solution we've ever seen.
It's exciting to think about all the possibilities, but I also know that even with the most promising scientific advances, there are always these political and logistical hurdles to overcome. What are some of the challenges that could stand in the way of this vaccine becoming a reality?
Well, funding is always a big challenge, especially right now. We need continued investment in research and development if we want to see these breakthroughs turn into real solutions. And then there's the issue of scaling up production and distribution.
Right. It's one thing to develop a vaccine in the lab, but it's another thing entirely to actually manufacture it and distribute it to millions and millions of people all around the world.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about all the regulatory hurdles that any new vaccine has to go through before it can be made available to the public.
It's a complex process with a lot of moving parts.
Yeah.
Makes me think about what's going on here in the US. We seem to be facing our own set of internal challenges related to HIV/AIDS policy.
Yeah, the U.S. is definitely facing some of its own unique challenges, and I think it's important to understand how these internal struggles impact the global fight against HIV.
Let's talk about what's happening on the home front. What are some of the policy issues that are affecting HIV prevention and treatment in the U.S. right now?
One major concern is the Trump administration's Project 2025. It aims to really reduce funding for PEPFAR, which is the president's emergency plan for AIDS relief.
That's really alarming considering how crucial PEPFAR has been to the global response to HIV.
Yeah.
What would the implications be if funding is cut for such an important program?
Well, PEPFAR has been crucial in giving so many countries around the world access to HIV prevention treatment and care. Cutting funding would be absolutely devastating.
It's like we're taking 2 steps back for every 1 step forward. And are there any other policy changes coming up that are concerning?
Well, another trend that's really worrying is the push to repeal the ACA protections for pre-TP coverage.
You mean this essential preventive medication could become inaccessible to so many Americans?
That's right. These decisions could have a huge impact on people's lives and their ability to access the healthcare they need.
It's a stark reminder that scientific progress doesn't exist in a bubble. Political decisions have a real impact on people's health and well-being. But it's not all bad news, is it? There have been some positive developments as well, right?
Absolutely. There have been some really encouraging advances in the U.S., especially when it comes to telehealth.
Oh yeah, telehealth has been a game changer during the pandemic. How is it being used in the fight against HIV?
Well, the expansion of telehealth services has made it so much easier for people to get HIV testing, counseling, and even medication. This is especially important for people in rural areas where they might not have easy access to specialized healthcare.
That's great. It sounds like there's a bit of a tug of war going on between these positive advancements and some of the political setbacks we've talked about. Where does that leave us in the overall fight against HIV in the U.S.?
It's a complex situation for sure, but I think the key takeaway is that we can't be complacent. We have to stay informed, engage in advocacy, and keep pushing for policies that put public health and access to care as top priorities.
You're absolutely right. We can't just sit back and wait for things to change. We have to be active participants in shaping the future of HIV's policy in this country. But before we wrap up this part of our discussion, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what the average person can do to make a difference in this fight. What can our listeners do to contribute?
You know, there's actually a lot that individuals can do even if they don't work in healthcare or policy. First and foremost, stay informed. Keep learning about HIV, the latest research, and the political landscape.
Knowledge is power, as they say. So what else can we do with that knowledge?
Contact your lawmakers. Urge them to restore funding for HIV programs, both here in the U.S. and internationally. Your voice does matter, and your elected officials need to hear from you.
That's a good point. We're not powerless in this fight. We can use our voices to advocate for change. What else can we do on a more personal level?
Get tested regularly. Knowing your status is so important. And with the advancements in telehealth, getting tested has never been easier. You can also support research by joining clinical trials for new vaccines and treatments.
Those are all great ideas.
Yeah.
It just goes to show that even small actions, when multiplied across many people, can have a huge impact.
Absolutely. And maybe most importantly, educate yourself and others about HIV/AIDS, challenge the stigma, and create a more supportive and informed environment. Every conversation, every act of kindness can truly make a difference.
It's about recognizing that we're all in this together. Ending HIV is going to require a collective effort, not just from scientists and policymakers, but from everyday people who care about creating a healthier and more just world. We've covered so much ground today, from global funding challenges to all the advances in treatment and prevention. It's clear that the fight against HIV is complex and constantly evolving.
It is, but despite all those challenges, there's a sense of hope and momentum that I find so inspiring.
I completely agree. We're seeing amazing progress in research, all these innovative approaches to care, and a growing awareness that we need to address the social and structural factors that make people more vulnerable to HIV. It's a reminder that even when things are tough, we can still make a difference.
Absolutely. And I think that's the perfect note to end this part of our conversation on. In the final part of our deep dive, we're going to be looking closer at the really cutting-edge research that's paving the way for a future without HIV.
Welcome back to HIV RNA Test Guide Podcast.
You know, over the last 2 parts of this deep dive, we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah. We've talked about the latest vaccine news,
Explored the challenges of access.
and even touched on the politics surrounding HIV and AIDS.
Right. Now for this final part, I think it's time to really shift our focus to the forefront of scientific innovation,
I like it. Let's do it.
where researchers are working on some groundbreaking approaches that could completely change how we think about HIV.
Okay, so we're talking about gene editing immunotherapy.
Right, those and other revolutionary strategies that could reshape how we approach HIV prevention and treatment.
All right, let's start with gene editing. It sounds like something straight out of a science fiction movie. Can you explain what it is in simple terms and how it's being used in HIV research?
Well, basically, gene editing allows scientists to make extremely precise changes to the genetic material of cells. Think of it like having a tiny microscopic toolkit that can zero in on specific genes and modify them.
Whoa, so we're talking about manipulating the building blocks of life.
Exactly. And when it comes to HIV, this technology opens up some truly incredible possibilities.
Like what?
Well, one approach is to use gene editing to actually get rid of HIV from infected cells.
Wait, are we talking about an actual cure here?
It's definitely a big step in that direction. Researchers are developing techniques that can target and remove the viral DNA that's embedded in the host cell's genome.
So it's like they're going in and surgically removing the virus from the cell?
That's one way to think about it, but there's another approach too. Scientists are also exploring ways to use gene editing to make cells resistant to HIV infection in the first place.
Okay, so instead of taking out the virus, we're stopping it from ever infecting the cells.
Precisely. We can edit the genes that make the proteins HIV uses to get into the cells and make them basically invisible to the virus.
So like building a wall around the cells to keep HIV out.
Perfect analogy. And the potential of gene editing goes even beyond that. Researchers are looking into ways to use it to actually boost the immune system's ability to fight HIV.
So we're not just preventing or curing infection, but also strengthening the body's natural defenses.
Exactly. Gene editing can be used to tweak immune cells and make them better at recognizing and attacking HIV-infected cells.
It's mind-blowing to think that we're so close to this new era in HIV research, where science fiction is becoming reality.
It really is. Gene editing is such a powerful tool and has enormous potential to change how we approach the fight against HIV.
Now let's move on to immunotherapy. It's another promising avenue in HIV research, right? How is immunotherapy different from gene editing?
Gene editing is all about directly changing the genetic material. Immunotherapy, on the other hand, is about taking advantage of the power of the immune system to fight off disease.
So we're talking about training the body's own defenses to become better at fighting HIV.
Exactly. HIV is a sneaky virus, always mutating and changing to evade the immune system.
It's like a master of disguise, constantly switching up its appearance to stay hidden.
That's a great way to put it. But immunotherapy is about giving the immune system the tools it needs to recognize and attack HIV, no matter how it tries to disguise itself.
I'm curious about the different immunotherapy approaches that are being explored. Can you give us some examples?
Well, one that's really showing a lot of promise is called CR T-cell therapy. That stands for chimeric antigen receptor T-cell therapy.
That's a mouthful. Can you break it down a little?
Sure. So basically in TR T-cell therapy, we take the patient's own immune cells, specifically T cells, and we modify them genetically to target HIV-infected cells.
So it's like we're engineering their immune system to become a better weapon against HIV.
That's the idea. We take these modified T cells and infuse them back into the patient where they can then go after and destroy those infected cells.
Like creating a specialized army of immune cells that are trained to fight HIV.
Exactly. There are other immunotherapy approaches being looked at too, like therapeutic vaccines.
Wait, I thought we were talking about preventative vaccines.
Yeah.
How's a therapeutic vaccine different?
A preventative vaccine, like the flu shot, is designed to stop you from getting infected in the first place. But a therapeutic vaccine is given to people who are already infected to help their immune system control or even eliminate the virus.
So it's more like giving their immune system a boost, helping it fight an existing infection more effectively.
That's right. Therapeutic vaccines for HIV are still in the early stages, but they have a lot of potential.
Wow. It's amazing to think that we might one day have a vaccine that can not only prevent HIV, but also help those who are already living with it.
That's a goal that researchers all over the world are working towards.
We've covered so much in this deep dive, from promising vaccine candidates to the complex politics surrounding HIV and AIDS. But what I find most inspiring is the incredible ingenuity and determination of the scientific community.
Absolutely. Despite the challenges, we're seeing remarkable progress in HIV research.
It really speaks to the power of human innovation and the commitment to finding a solution to this global health crisis.
And it gives us real hope for a future where HIV is no longer a threat to human health and well-being.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the world of HIV. We hope you found it informative and maybe even left with a sense of hope for the future.
And don't forget, even in the face of complex challenges, there's always reason to believe in the power of science and the possibility of a brighter tomorrow.
If you'd like to learn more or find some helpful resources, please visit our website at hivrnatusguide.com. Until next time, stay safe and stay informed.